Good afternoon, I'm Tim Lynch. I am the host of Legal Lines. Legal Lines is brought to you by the Massachusetts LGBTQ Bar Association, and we're brought to you live the third Wednesday of every month at this time. Our guest here today is KT Crossman. KT is part of Transformative Justice Legal Services, and KT will be telling us a little bit about what that organization does and what kind of cases they handle. If you'd like to tune in, please feel free to do so. Our number hopefully will be on the screen. There you go, 617-708-3290, 617-708-3290. Thank you. KT, how are you?
I'm well, Tim. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Let me ask you a couple of questions. You're with Transformative Justice Legal Services. What is that?
So Transformative Justice Legal Services is a nonprofit legal organization. We provide legal representation really to anyone, but our focus is on providing legal representation for transgender and gender nonconforming folks.
And just for the purposes of our listening audience,
Sure.
When we say transgender, what do we mean by that?
So transgender and gender nonconforming, those words apply to a community of folks who don't necessarily identify as either male or female, or folks who were assigned male or female at birth and identify as something else. Maybe they were assigned female at birth and identify as a man. Folks have all sorts of medical procedures or not. They use all kinds of pronouns. I myself use they, them, and theirs. It's a pretty large community. It's sort of an umbrella term, so a lot of this is on a case-by-case basis.
Sure. It's a wide spectrum of folks,
Yeah,
isn't it?
very much so.
So, cool. And so what kind of services do you perform?
Primarily, we provide legal representation to folks whose cases we take on. We also do sort of know your rights trainings for people in a variety of different areas: housing, workers' rights, interactions with the police. We hope to also at some point start doing some cultural competency trainings for other lawyers or law firms who have trans and gender nonconforming clients.
What a wonderful service, I must say. I say that, and this is since I was on the Joint Task Force on LGBTQ youth in the court system.
Oh, yeah.
And it was shocking to me that in 2013 there were no protocols for dealing with LGBTQ youth by many state departments, including the Department of Family and Child Services, probation, court staff.
Yeah.
So it's such a pleasure to hear that there is another nonprofit organization out there doing this work, because it needs to be done.
It really does, yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? How do you go about doing this kind of training with folks?
Well, we've only been open since May, so we haven't actually done any of the cultural competency trainings yet. And I think it would be fairly tailored depending on the group. If there's a level of cultural competency there already, what kinds of cases they're seeing. But it would sort of be a what we call Trans 101, which is talking to folks about what does it mean to be transgender or gender nonconforming, and then how does that intersect with the legal system, and sort of what issues folks might see about, for instance, asking a judge to use someone's preferred name and pronouns in a courtroom, or asking opposing counsel to do the same thing.
Basic courtesy.
You would think, yeah. Unfortunately, it's not always that obvious to folks.
Yeah, and it's an interesting term, obvious to folks, because once people learn, the vast majority of people, I don't know if you find that true, but I've often found it true, but the vast majority of people want to be polite.
Yes.
And so they're
Mostly.
just mostly, but they're just uninformed.
Yeah.
And so it's wonderful that you have these training programs which basically inform people about things that they just either are unaware of or just need some education about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are often uncomfortable. They know they should ask about someone's pronouns, but they think that it's rude, or they don't know how to ask. And it really, there are some pretty simple ways to do that, but if you don't know what they are, it can be daunting.
I know that the the LGBTQ Bar Association now has on name tags at
Yes.
all events what your preferred pronoun is.
Yeah. That was a policy that we pushed pretty hard for on the Committee for Transgender Inclusion, which is a part of the Bar Association. And that went through last year, just about a year ago, I think.
Yes, I voted on that.
Great, thank you.
My last year, one of my last
We
years on the
appreciate it.
board. No, I think it's, again, to me, it goes back to basic courtesy.
Yeah.
And it's so important to make, my understanding is you always want the person you're talking to feel comfortable.
Yes.
And how better than knowing how to address them.
Yes, yes, and also about questions not to ask.
Yes. Well, that always surprises me when you get into that as well.
Yeah.
But you're a lawyer.
I am a lawyer.
And
Yes.
I'm always
Newly
happy.
so.
Newly so. God bless you. Welcome to the club.
Thanks.
And you handle a lot of cases involving transgender folks.
Well, we hope to. We have, so we've been open, like I said, since May, and I think we have about 8 to 10 clients right now, a whole range of different issues.
Like, what kind of issues do you handle?
Well, so the idea behind the organization was that trans and gender nonconforming folks don't just face sort of trans issues. They lead full and complex lives, and those involve interactions with the legal system in any number of places. It's often complicated by the fact that they're trans or gender nonconforming, and so they're facing added levels of discrimination, or just it's hard to access services. So we do what might first come to mind when you hear about a nonprofit doing legal services for trans and gender nonconforming folks. We do name changes, we do appeals for folks whose insurance has denied coverage for some medical procedure that they need. But we also do other sorts of things. I do a lot of housing personally, and some of the housing cases I see involve discrimination on the basis of gender identity, but some of them are just people who need a lawyer to help them because the conditions in their apartment are bad, or because their landlord is evicting them.
So how do you go about proving a case when somebody comes into your office and says, I'm being discriminated against in housing, for example, or in employment? I mean, you're I've had many people on here talk about the law and things like that, but
Yeah.
you're more of a nuts and bolts person. You're the person that has to go in there and litigate the case.
Yeah.
So somebody comes in and, I think I've been discriminated against.
Yeah.
So how would you, like your housing cases, how do you proceed with that?
Well, it can be really hard to prove discrimination unless someone has said something outright. And sometimes even then, it can be hard to prove. I haven't actually been in front of MCAD, the Commission Against Discrimination, yet, where most of these cases would be heard. But there would have to be a lot of evidence. You would have to have your client's testimony and probably some really blatant things that happened or things that were said in order to make the case. Or you just have to have lots and lots of compelling, persuasive evidence that there's a pattern and practice of not approving trans tenants for housing in a particular apartment building, but approving everybody else. There are places. Suffolk University Law School has a housing testing program where they'll send folks out to sort of see if discrimination is happening in a particular building, and that's really useful. You can ask for that.
So Suffolk University sends folks out that are self-identify as trans, or just
And a variety
different things.
Yeah. So there are discrimination in housing is prohibited on a number of
Different classes.
Right. And so the race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, family status, a whole huge range. And so they'll send two people to the same place, or two people make the same phone call, and their sort of stories are the same in every way except one.
Except one.
Right.
Well, that usually leads to interesting result there.
I would imagine, yeah.
So, but I would imagine the typical person comes in, at least I found, if they say they've been discriminated, it's always like, well, why? You know what I mean? And then it just seems to me a lot of people who do discriminate tend not to be judicious in what they say. So yeah, there would be some commentary, I would think.
Yeah.
But the other thing I think you latched upon there is disparate impact.
Yes.
So you always want to look for patterns, and so, and as you say, how does this person treat people of this particular class, transgender folks, compared to how this employer or landlord treats the general public, or people of the same type as the landlord?
Right.
You know, and
Right.
see if there's a disparate impact, if the impact is very different on a particular group. And if it is different, then the question is why.
Right.
So it's assumed that it's discriminatory unless the landlord or the employer can come up with a reason for why.
Exactly.
So it makes the cases interesting, I would think.
Yeah, and often sad, you know,
Yeah.
because there are often people who come in who really have been discriminated against, and there's just not enough evidence to prove it, or it doesn't, you know, rise to the level of something that a court is going to say, yeah, you're right, that was discrimination, and you're owed some sort of reparation for that or some sort of remedy.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting upon a very important point. I think the public has this perception whenever these laws are passed outlawing discrimination. There's, you know, as I recall way back in the, I'm going to age myself, but way back in the 90s, when a lot of these laws were put in place for the L and the G anyway,
Right.
people said, well, they're getting special rights.
Right.
You know, and it's an interesting argument, you're getting special rights, but because people think it's very easy to say I've been discriminated against.
Right.
And that leads to, as you say, you know, compensation for the harm caused by that discrimination. But it's very hard to prove these cases.
It's incredibly hard. Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely.
You know, unless you have somebody who really isn't judicious and makes lots and lots of statements.
Yep.
And that are, somehow you can prove those statements. It's not, you know, one person says it and the other person says, no, I didn't say that.
Right, right.
But, you know, says it where multiple people hear it or it's recorded somehow or
Right.
something like that. So that's hard.
It is hard.
And then disparate impact is very hard because, wow, I mean, you know, it's easy to say, well, how did they treat this group compared to the general public or people like that employer? Well, think about that for a second.
Right.
How fact intensive is that?
Right.
And how much information you need to go through to prove that?
Yeah.
It's quite an awesome task, which is why I always like lawyers who do this type of work. Because you're typically the unsung heroes who go out there and and fight the good fight.
I think you're right. I think there is a misperception that, well, if you have a law against discrimination, then discrimination will stop happening, or people will have a remedy in that law. And the thing that I learned while I was at law school is that the law is only the solution for this many of the problems.
Yeah.
And for other things, that's what you need community organizing for, that's what you need social justice movements for, that's what you need lobbyists for. You know, that's why it's so great that we have the Mass Transgender Political Caucus.
Oh, God bless them.
Yes.
You guys, they do such awesome work. I'm always impressed. And why don't you tell the webpage for that organization? Because I've always led people to that webpage. That is an amazing webpage. The Mass, the CTI.
Oh, MTPC.
MTPC.
So MTPC is the Massachusetts Transgender Political Caucus, and I am not going to remember the website off the top of my head, but you can Google
it.
MTPC Boston and you'll find it.
Yeah, I think it's mtcp.org, but maybe I'm